but Gaul's harvests were fickle and German resistance was not. Whole convoys vanished in alpine fog, swallowed by mud or intercepted by Ligurian raiders. When Belly betrayed bivouac, when rations dwindled to diluted vinegar, and Moldy spelt the chain of command thinned visibly. Officers dined in dry tents. Enlisted men chewed silence as loud as any horn. Within each leather tent, a contubernium of 8 shared more than space. They shared heat, idle gossip, and grudges that could outlast a cohort's life. Dice clicked near oil lamps. Laughter followed whispered names of local girls, and unofficial marriages thrived among the camp followers, despite the legal fiction that every soldier was celibate until discharge. Brotherhood turned to bitterness when pay was late or the promise of Roman land felt like a fading horizon. In Rhaetia, one bitter winter, that bitterness lit fires not sanctioned by any centurion. Discipline held, but only just. The centurio, marked by his transverse crest and calloused hand, kept order with hourly drills and visible punishments. A soldier could survive a German arrow, but not a lapse in formation. Yet the whip could not silence desperation. In AD 6, whispers spread through the northern ranks about land grants delayed, coin clipped or counterfeit, and favors shown to local auxiliaries. By the time the cohort heard the tuba in the morning, the loyalty that bound man to standard had already frayed. Inside the camp, not all eyes were Roman. Scouts, interpreters, and slaves filled functional niches, the silent majority of any campaign, but they brought risk in equal measure. On one forgettable autumn night near the Elbe, a German stable hand failed to appear at morning muster. His bedroll was unrolled but cold, and by nightfall the 14th Legion was encircled. Fire arrows hissed through the needles, and someone, perhaps the same boy, had buried a stylus map of the camp under damp leaves for the enemy to find. Coin was the other lubricant of trust, and its corrosion. Rome promised ore but paid in worn denarii. After 20 years, a veteran might receive land in Dalmatia or Pannonia, or he might receive nothing but a scroll with a broken seal. Under Emperor Tiberius delayed, pay sparked fury not against the German foes, but against the tribuni in their dry tents, tallying silver with soft hands and no scars. Still, even amid corruption and cold, the divine was present. Every camp held shrines, to Mars, to Jupiter, to Mithras. Some were mere altars, others canvas-choked spaces lit by wax and incense. Soldiers knelt where they had once bled. But as Eastern cults promised secret ascents to immortality, and as comrades disappeared in flooded forests, even Rome's pantheon felt distant. The divine contract frayed, the offerings became insurance, not devotion. Yet the legions endured. Steel, salt, and superstition fortified the perimeter as much as ramparts. The danger came not only from without but from within. Centurions who feared their own men, generals unsure if the next crisis would rise from tribal horn blasts or whispered mutiny. The vexillum still flew high red against the dusk, but the fire awaited beyond it, patient and ancient. Beyond the trench, the forest watched unmoved, and the trees never slept. The Roman marching camp was not merely shelter, it was geometry in defense of imperium. Each day's advance ended not with rest but with reckoning and rhythm. As the sun fell over hostile terrain, whether the washed gray of Britannia or the pine-choked gloom of the Hercynian forest, the engineers took command. Surveyors unwrapped cords, planted their groma, and under the watchful eyes of the centurions, the land was divided like a census, measured, ordered, and taxed with labor. 1,000 paces square traced by spikes and sweat. Timber palisades would rise before sleep dared. At its center stood the Via Praetoria, the camp's spine running from the front gate straight to the commander's tent, the Praetorium. To its left and right, the Via Principalis intersected, anchoring the heart of the camp like the decumanus of a Roman city. This was not coincidence, it was doctrine. Rome imposed her will not only through conquest, but through a cartographer's mind. Every castrum mirrored the last, a template stamped onto wilderness ditches, dug ramparts, heaped gates aligned to compass points and military hierarchy. These straight lines bred more than safety. They bred habit and trust. The legate knew his tribuni lay to the east, the primus pilus to the north, and each century of the legio nested in its designated slot like tesserae in a mosaic. The men could pitch their leather tents in darkness and still find their fire, their comrades, their place. Order became instinct even as chaos churned beyond the ramparts. Yet the camp's marital regularity could never guarantee permanence. The vallum, a ditch with sharpened stakes and earthen wall behind, could grip the land but not master it. Floods in Britannia turned ditches into moats ideal for neither drainage nor defense. Trees crashed in German winds, swatting palisades like pestles. In Dacia's high valley, snowfall buried pathways so deeply that legionaries marched through their own camp, blinded, relying on rope lines to navigate the layout they themselves had built. Symmetry held, but barely. These grids were fragile skeletons beneath bandaged terrain, always vulnerable to breach, not only by clever foes, but by time itself. One missed patrol, one collapsed gate at the Porta di Cumana, and the interior lines unraveled. The square had no sanctity once pierced. What had been a fortress became a slaughter-yard carved at right angles. And yet the Romans rebuilt. They were taught from the first day of service that a camp could be raised from nothing in under 6 hours. 8 soldiers per contubernium, 1 tent, 1 shared spade. Walls of turf and timber materialized overnight because failure meant vulnerability, and vulnerability death. Even under rain, even hunted by unseen enemies, the rhythm remained stake, dig, stack, secure. Smells clung to the process. The sour musk of sweat mixed with sap from freshly felled trees. Fire warmed pitch as it sealed gaps between palisade boards. Crushed pine needles cushioned steps in alpine deployments. Rank smoke from hastily dug latrines lingered. Noise echoed in hammer strikes and shouted measurements in the distant thud of piled earth. Each camp beat was both preparation and testimony. We were here, we are ready, we will remain. The dignity of the legions depended not just on discipline in the field, but discipline at rest. Time moved through a Roman camp not in idle leisure, but ordered clocks, first watch, second, third. Night guards rotated under the tesserarius, passwords shifted daily, and even where no enemy loomed, silence was enforced at sundown. The tent lines became arteries of civic design, each carrying not just heat and food, but law. The danger, however, was not always external. A well-mapped castrum offered efficiencies, but also patterns. When treachery struck, it often walked familiar paths. Arminius knew this when leading Roman-trained Germans against Varus. His warriors struck not blind, but guided, until symmetry collapsed with fire. And in Egypt, one rebellious cohors turned the grid against its officers, pinning them in known routes between gates during a midnight insurrection. There were times when Roman commanders questioned the value of so many squares. When ambushes became routine in Illyria and snow drowned the lines of Sena Gallica, some urged abandoning the geometric perfection and relying on terrain. But the army trained in repetition and logic resisted this chaos. If Rome let the forest dictate the shape of her sanctuary, what remained between her and the tribes she sought to subdue? Still, the ground remembered failures. Some camps were abandoned after one night, 2 exposed, 2 soggy, 2 bloodstained. Others became permanent, their hastily dug vallum replaced by stone walls, their timber watchtowers solidified in brick. Eventually, these would form the spines of new coloniae and frontier towns. Yet the shadow of marching camps lingered longest in those that vanished, leaving behind nothing but soil memories and the faintest lines visible from the sky or churning plow echoes of a war grid sworn to mathematics and Mars alike. Beyond each castrum's gate the unknown waited. Even the most precise plan could not account for the next hill, the next river too wide to ford, or the next tribal spearpoint glimpsed just beyond the tree line. Rome measured her order in timber, but the forest still remembered how to whisper past ramparts and how to burn what stood too straight for too long. The Roman soldier marched not only with shield and sword, but with a stomach that ration and rhythm kept in strict formation. Behind each line of pila, and under every banner swayed the deeper engine of empire, the Annona Rome's vast and mobile ration system. Grain moved where troops did, pulled in mule-drawn wagons or sledded across winter mud, calculated by quartermasters in wax tablets and weighed by dignity and discipline. If the wooden treads of supply carts stopped creaking then, so too did the heartbeat of the castra. Steel could win battles. Bread won campaigns. A legion's day began not with trumpets but with grinding stone. Each contubernium, the basic 8-man unit, shared a portable quernstone. Before dawn, a rhythm of scraping rock and murmured grumbling filled the camps as grain was ground into coarse flour, baked hastily into round bread in clay ovens or stirred into dense porridge. This was the staple that held provinces together from Dacia to Africa Proconsularis. Flesh, when it came, arrived in salted strips from pigs or goats, barely enough for flavor. Lentils and chickpeas stretched meals into functional boredom. Fermented wine acetum watered into sour, tang washed it down. To complain was fruitless, to protest lines was mutiny. Logistically, the Annona Militaris moved faster than justice, and often with more predictability. Under Augustus and his successors, supply officers, Praefecti Annani, linked the granaries of Cisalpine Gaul and Hispania, with the camps strung from the Danube to the Syrian frontier. Barges drifted wheat down the Rhone and Seion across the Po and onward through the Alpine passes by Oxgard into Germania Superior. But when a harvest failed, when a Gallic frost shortened the barley crop or flooding worsened in the Moselle, supply lines buckled. Grain spoiled in wet sacks, mules died on frozen ground, and the bread ration thinned to half. Hungry men did not drill. Hungry men broke ranks. During Trajan's Dacian campaigns, entire squadrons of pack animals were lost in the Carpathians. Winter froze the supply road faster than engineers could clear it. The legions, isolated and undersupplied, relied on emergency stores. Hardtack rations sealed in wax satchels, barely edible after days in sleet and rot. The dull crunch between a soldier's teeth in such conditions was the sound of loyalty fading. Rumors traveled faster than grain convoys, and they gnawed at cohesion. Some claimed the emperor valued stone arches and triumphs more than bellies at the front. Others, darker still, said that Rome had overreached its margins, and the gods were thinning the grain to signal retreat. Despite careful arithmetic, the average legionary consumed nearly 1.5 kilograms of wheat per day. Multiply that across 50 men, and the mathematics of empire had to be solved daily on muddy roads. Storage huts at the edge of each castrum had to be stacked and guarded with near-religious attention. Any lapse could ruin both morale and mobility. No column broke camp without a clear plan for resupply. Grain wagons were as vital as siege towers. When Caesar crossed into Germania to avenge the massacre at Aduatuca, his first move was not tactical, it was logistical. He reinforced pontoon bridges, then ensured the Annona would follow. Swords could cut, but they could also wait. Bread could not. And yet something stranger than starvation always loomed at the camp's edge. Along the Rhine, legionaries began demanding barley beer in place of wine. Imported from local tribes, it matched their taste better than the sour Roman acetum, and it fermented faster. At first, commanders permitted it, better drunk than disloyal, they reasoned. But as preferences shifted and soldiers clustered around local taverns or semi-illicit brewing casks hidden behind latrines, cohesion frayed. Rome's identity enforced in palate and ritual slipped beneath the crops of another land. Men grow restless not just from pain but from monotony. Meals repeated, then degraded. Bread without salt. Porridge stretched too thin. Meat gone. Then the anger began. Knives were laid too close to throats during arguments. The tent line murmured first about supply failures, later about betrayal. Why did the equites still dine generously in the command tents? Why did officers receive amphorae of Italian olive oil, while regulars boiled with animal tallow? Once in a Numidian outpost, ration riots erupted when spoiled grain was distributed to veterans. 3 centurions died. Two were set on fire in their own tents, smothered in the grain sacks they refused to share. Even love, or something like it, flickered under the belly's rule. The camp followers, Lixie water carriers' unofficial wives, often bartered favors for food, not coin. Among starving men, a handful of olives or a small wedge of cheese altered destinies, bought silence, or traded futures. Here appetite shaped affection. Rome legislated against official marriage for soldiers precisely to prevent divided loyalties. But even the strictest laws wilt under hunger. When crops in Belgica failed in 88 CE, and the Moselle flooded 2 bridges, Rome did not fear the Germans beyond the border. It feared its own legions. Fed poorly paid, late anchored in damp mud outside Augusta Treverorum, they began to calculate loyalty against need, service against silence. And from silence came oaths, private ones not to the emperor, but to each other. The smell of moldy grain was the scent of approaching collapse. In some castra, soldiers began baking flatbread mixed with sawdust to stretch supply. Others rigged dice to steal rations. When the flour was gone, the dice determined who starved. When the dice failed, the knives came out. And yet Rome marched on for now. The next convoy was due. The next tax shipment from Narbonensis had been dispatched. But the nights came colder and carts cracked on frostbitten roads. Somewhere out there beneath a Greco-Roman sky, the rations might never arrive. And men with empty stomachs would make fateful decisions under moonlight, breadless, sleepless, loyal only to the hand that gave them food. A Roman contubernium, 8 men sharing one leather tent, was less a military unit than a crucible. Not all bonds were forged on the battlefield. Most began under canvas sewn, into the daily grime of 20 toes scraping against cold soil, 20 fingers fumbling for the same ration bag, the same dice, the same cup of sour wine. In these close quarters of canvas and sweat, a man's enemies were often no further than his firelight, and his only protection was obedience, loyalty, or laughter. When the legions halted, and the bugle signaled camp, construction soldiers moved like clockwork, ditch dug, palisade raised, tents placed in ordered rigidity, always the same pattern, whether amid the olive groves of Numidia or beneath the dripping canopy of Germania. And once the tent rose, a pitched triangle of treated hides carried by mule and memory, the small world of the contubernium reassembled, bedrolls laid out in a single line, helmets stacked in formation, decks of knucklebone dice cracked onto wooden boards stamped with imperial eagles. Inside, the tent hierarchy still held, though without insignia. Veterans claimed the dry patch near the center, closer to the pack, containing cooking tools and spare tunics. Younger recruits made do with the draft-swept edges. Equipment always within arm's reach hung at the tent posts. Gladius Pugio belt buckles polished from habit more than pride. And every dusk brought the rituals of familiarity, oiling boots to shield them from rot, tightening leather larica straps with half-laughed curses, and sharing tales half-true of a tavern girl in Antioch or a bear fight scene in Britain. But discipline yielded to proximity. Soldiers gambled not only with copper asses but with trust. A slit throat in the darkness meant more than theft. It meant suspicion cast over every shared meal, every shoulder that had once shielded yours in a charge. Tempers flared over bad food, uneven shares of barley or honeyed wine, a stolen ring, a missing cloak. And in times of silence, especially after the bugle had faded and only the creak of branches spoke, some whispered envy stoked nights hotter than campaign fires. It was here that Rome's moral code found its soft boundaries. Military commanders largely turned a blind eye to liaisons, with camp followers provided camp routine remained undisturbed. These women, vendors, lovers, wives in all but law, moved along with the legion's unofficial but ever-present living in makeshift shelters behind the vallum. Messy entanglements bloomed and soured next to weapons stacked by tent flaps. Fraternization blurred into informal families, a soldier's own child toddling past a pila rack, while generals at headquarters kept order with ink and decree, unaware or uninterested in the intimate infractions of their men. Resentment, however, brewed not from such ties but from broken promises. When discharge pay delayed or rumors swirled that veterans' land parcels in Baetica had been reassigned to equestrian claimants, grumblings began among the lowest ranks. And it was in the tents that such grievances first found voice. The contubernium, after all, was not just a sleeping cell but a political node. Complaints about meager food over long watches, unjust floggings, passed from one tent to another before reaching centurions' ears. Mutiny did not erupt in assembly fields, it formed in whispered knots under patchwork roofs, when loyalty felt expendable and hopes of reward drifted too far into imperial abstraction. The breakdown could be as subtle as a lost rhythm in the morning. Routine fewer jokes at dawn, bedrolls left sloppily tied orders executed with just enough delay to be noticed. In one winter defile along the Upper Rhine, a legion found its command unraveling after months without mail or money. That frost-hardened canvas, once a cell of camaraderie, became breeding ground for seditious chants. "We die where Caesar does not look," a line scratched onto a wooden mess dish passed quietly from one tent to the next. Within days, a junior officer's tent was slashed down in the night, its supports scattered like chopped kindling. No one saw the culprits and no one asked. Even those who remained loyal found solace in small rebellions, hiding extra firewood, bartering with camp followers against orders, smuggling letters to kin through the merchants who shadowed military columns. For every tent that upheld the dignity of Roman order, another critiqued it through action too slight for tribunician punishment, but too clear to ignore. And always the sky bore silent witness. Leather darkened with mildew when rains persisted too long, stiffened in cold, so harsh fingers split at the seams, cramming bedrolls into packs before march orders. The tent was not refuge. It was the membrane between Roman control and everything unspoken that threatened it: hunger, longing, revenge. As spring approached and rumors of a campaign into Sarmatian steppe lands began to hum through the ranks, the tent's familiar enclosure no longer soothed. It confined. For every man within, restlessness gathered like sweat-soaked linen, and all new unity under canvas could crumble with one unpaid coin or one centurion's insult too many. And outside the ramparts, watching fires smoldered in tree lines that did not forget Roman steel or its fractures. Rhaetia, deep winter, the year barely past the consulship of Severus and Geta. Snow crept through the folds of leather awnings, lifting the sacking between turf walls, hissing against hot iron braziers. Here, under the sullen weight of the northern sky, the legions endured not just the enemy beyond the vallum, but a silent corrosion within. For in every ordered camp, every precisely measured castrum from the Porta Praetoria to the Via Decumana, the true authority rested not in Rome's banners, nor the emperor's face on coin, but in the fist and voice of the centurio. A century, 80 men on paper fewer in the weathered flesh of campaign, feared their centurio more than the foe. His rank came not by patrician birth or senatorial favor, but by blood scars and the unflinching capacity to impose Rome's most abstract value, disciplina. In a world where courage bloomed briefly and the charge, disciplina, endured in the endless drills and the patient geometry of formations in the bite of the vitus, the vine staff both badge and weapon. To a soldier, the vitus was as familiar as his own gladius and far more intimate. It struck not the enemy, but him. One missed pace in a formation, one murmured complaint after watch, one hasty withdrawal from the line without formal recall. For these a centurio offered no hearing. He struck, without delay, without audience, without explanation. Leather whips were licit for the rankers, the milits gregari. A rod to the ribs reminded them of Rome's law far more effectively than scrolls or oaths. Soldiers bled into snow and soil, not only in skirmishes, but before the eyes of their own contubernales, rendered spectacles for the sake of cohesion. Behind every brutal act was strategic purpose: keep order by making disorder synonymous with pain. But even pain dispensed too often or unfairly bred sullen frost rather than unity. By routine the rod ruled, but in Rhaetia the routine broke. Hunger had come first gnawing through the meatless weeks. The Annona Militaris, Rome's vaunted logistics net, sagged under snow-choked passes and raids on supply mules west of Augusta Vindelicum. Rumors followed that shipments were being redirected to Pannonia, that the governor had petitioned for rations meant for the Legio III Italica to aid a senator's estate under siege. Next came the delay in stipendia wages withheld without message from Rome. The signifer kept silent. The optio could not say why. Pay charts grew dust. Dice turned to daggers over coppers. And so the centurions, once the embodiment of order, became its slow undoing. Their authority had always rested on twin pillars: the visible hand that builds and the feared hand that breaks. With the gears of empire stalling, food short, pay frozen, furloughs denied, fear calcified into resentment. It began not in some sudden revolt, but in small refusals. Camp duty avoided, a cloak not folded despite inspection, a sentry lane patrolled with deliberate neglect. When the Centurio Morris struck a veteran of 12 campaigns for improper dress, the man lunged not away but forward. In the frozen mud before the tribune's tent, restraint gave way to rebellion in miniature. They called it discipline, but in the moment it was blood upon the ice. The primus pilus, oldest and seniormost among the centurions, tightened security. Double watches, torches kept lit from dusk until first call. No tent doors unlatched without challenge and reply. He now slept with his blade drawn not by regulation but fear, not of Germans but Romans. The camp held barely, but the relationship between rod and rank no longer did. In the small hours, an immunes, once shielded from duty by technical skill, was found strangled with his own tool belt. The cause? A hoarded supply of barley cake left unshared. Days later, mule guards escorted parcels of bronze coinage finally sent from Noricum, too late. One chest arrived split open, ore spilled into the snow, pressed into worthless slurry by boots. No man stooped to gather them, yet through it the forms endured. The standards remained upright. Prayers to Mars and Mithras were offered at dawn roll call. The drills resumed, reduced in number but performed with clenched jaws. When the enemy finally tested the gates in early spring, the legions still answered. Their discipline, impaired but not extinguished, held the line. But what had once been obedience born of conviction now resembled muscle memory of a machine slowly forgetting its purpose. Even as spring thawed the roads and Rome began her slow act of repair, supplies resumed tribunician, promises whispered, decorations awarded, the frostline of rage remained. The Centurio now faced his men with barked orders that no longer struck like iron. Authority had not collapsed, but it had cracked, and once cracked it waits for a colder winter. Near the Elbe, another camp prepared to receive the next wave. Quiet, geometrical, familiar, but beyond its ditches, behind the larch forest, the air held more than snow. In the bitter autumn of 9 CE, as Varus, legions carved a line through northern Germania. One camp spread its regular grid beneath a darkening sky near the Elbe's marshy tributaries. The castrum, like all others before it, had been raised in haste. Standard dimensions, identical streets, the Via Principalis intersecting the Via Praetoria, the vallum rimmed with sharpened stakes. By the 14th hour, the camp's geometry was complete, order imposed upon mud. But this frontier bore no peace. It breathed with the silence of trees that listened. And among the grooms, cooks, and translators sheltering inside Rome's military skin, one boy did not belong. He had no Latin name. The pay scrolls knew him only as an auxiliary slave assigned to the stables of Legio XVII. A thin youth with soil-caked fingers and ash-blonde hair, he moved unnoticed among the pack mules and cavalry mounts. He cleaned tack, fetched kindling, and watched as the engineers unpacked scroll tubes, as officers marked terrain with stylus and cord. In Roman eyes, he was no one, but to the bructeri beyond the river, he was a knife waiting to turn in the palm. By protocol, all non-legion personnel were stamped to functional use. Scouts from allied tribes, interpreters from subdued hill forts, camp followers, some wives, most not, serving convenience, desire, and trade. even freedmen from previous campaigns branded with duty or death. These were the human mortar inside Roman camps held by loyalty, fear, or coin. But trust was never absolute. Centurions monitored headcounts with a punishing eye. Still, amid 2 legions and a vexillation of cavalry, one boy's face could blur into the fog of routine. That night he vanished. No torn flap, no alarmed sentry, just a missing bucket at the horse line and a hastily emptied tack chest. Within hours, cavalry scouts found blood-dark hoof prints in the reeds beyond the Porta di Cumana. And worse, one of the field maps prepared by the Praefectus Castrorum was gone, stripped from its oil skin. It depicted not just the Elbe, but the routes of 3 outposts feeding Rome's autumn advance. A geometrical wound now lay open in the forest. By dawn, vengeance rose. Patrols combed the darkened trails. Auxiliaries presumed innocent yesterday now faced interrogation lines, and the rods of options uncoiling like vipers. But interrogation could not breach what the night had sealed. Hours later, at the eastern tree-line, soldiers found a mule skinned and beheaded, a bructory torque nailed into its flank with a fragment of Roman iron. No ambush followed. That would come later. First came fear, sharp, invisible, and corrosive. Trust, once fractured inside the camp, spreads faster than any column can march. Every man began to watch the kitchen smoke too closely. Each whispered word in Gallic Thracian or Germanic bent ears and narrowed eyes. Was that Greek interpreter lingering near the Sacellum to pray or to listen? One disloyal face makes every unfamiliar accent an echo of betrayal. The Tribuni Militum debated withdrawal. Some counseled entrenchment, others punitive raids. The map's loss, they reasoned, might not be fatal, unless the bructory already understood Roman logistical rhythms, which they did. For months, Rome's timber convoys had passed the same tributary villages. The same cohorts gathered fodder from the same glades. And now, from the boys' vantage, the camp's internal order, the water points, command tents, and artillery lines, had been revealed not just as a strength, but as a target. In the days that followed, no full-scale assault came, but every bell brought warning. Horses bolted at false alarms. Grain carts were found plundered and burned downstream. One water patrol returned short by 3 men. No sign of a fight, just vanished. The forest, it seemed, had opened its hand, fingers reaching to pluck at Rome's insecurities. Snow came early that year. By November, frost carried through the leather tents, and the contubernia muttered under breath. Rations short. The Annona supply into the Elbe corridor slowed, perhaps intercepted, perhaps abandoned. But beneath it all rose a subtler anxiety, that every stable hand, every translator, every seemingly loyal face might wear a second loyalty beneath the tunic. The centurions restored order with lash and drill. But order imposed on suspicion cannot run as deeply as order drawn on papyrus. In the weeks to come, beneath the whispering pines and rotting palisades, the bructory did not need to strike with an army. They had already entered the camp, not with swords, but through silence and flight. And within the grid, every soldier knew the next map wouldn't be stolen. It would be followed. A strange face would point not the way to conquest, but the way back to slaughter through the woods. The castrum, once ruled by lines and law, had begun to watch itself from the inside. Some dangers stand at the gate, others sleep beside the fire, and over every tent and trench hung the same unspoken question: who built this camp, and who remembers every foot of it better than we do? By the reign of Tiberius, the Roman camp was more than a fort. It was a machine fed by grain, guarded by timber, and welded together by pay. But near the Rhine and deep in Pannonia's cold river valleys, that machine strained under the weight of promises deferred. Soldiers who marched under the vexillum for coin now found their fists clenching for something more tangible: land, honor, or vengeance. Since Augustus' legionary pay had remained locked at 900 sestertii per annum, a static wage in a world of shifting loyalties. Enlistment lasted 16 years at a minimum, longer for unlucky men far from Rome's grace. And over those years, bronze coins, Darkened silver thinned and hope for swift discharge wore away like footprints in snow. The denarius itself betrayed them. Once near pure silver by the early 1st century, the content had begun to dilute, sometimes subtly, sometimes more nakedly. Paymasters knew it, tribuni laticlavi nodded indifferently, and centurions ever practical kept the whips moving. But the rank-and-file miles felt it between thumb and tooth. Coin weighed less, shone duller, and stretched shorter across a soldier's needs. Replacements, bribes, gaming, drink, girls, and the extra food to supplement the same Annona rations year after year. Promised land at retirement was meant to salve the waiting, but land does not buy sandals or stitch wounds or warm a tent in Rhaetian snowfall. In that brittle calculus, discipline held as long as loyalty remained profitable, and when that bargain faltered, the camp shuddered. After Augustus' death in 14 CE, that shudder cracked into open mutiny. The legions in Pannonia and Germania, veterans and fresh recruits both, erupted. Too many campaigns, too few rewards. Assembled in their castra, they demanded coin, not posthumous honors on a stela but silver in hand. Some stabbed their centurions. When the princeps' adopted son Drusus arrived to pacify them, his own tent nearly kindled with fury. These men had built roads, driven stake palings along the Danube, and drowned comrades in moats dug in frostbitten swamps. They did not crave speeches. They craved the aureus, and beneath it, what the aureus meant: recognition from an emperor who slept safely in marble halls while they bled under pine-canopied skies. The imperial system bought peace by proximity, favor in exchange for loyalty. But far from Rome, where rescriptum and reward came slow and thin, that contract frayed. It was not just silver that failed. The pay chest, when it arrived, might be late, might be light, might vanish en route to some Gallic ambush or German betrayal. So distributions were delayed, sometimes by months. Senior officers, legati Augusti, tribuni militum, and their notaries would calculate arrears inside weatherproof tents, while soldiers in sodden tunics shivered outside, watching coins slip between fingers they did not trust. And they noticed what those fingers wore: rings glinting under wax lamps, imported cloaks, sandals without patches. The divide inside the camp walls grew not between Roman and barbarian, but between poor Roman and wealthy one. One counted coins, the other swore oaths in blood to receive them. Rumors did what the best orators feared: they organized the discontent. Soldiers whispered of prior premia denied, of comrades discharged without land allotments, or if land was given, it was stony hillsides far from any road. Of emperors who lavished coin on praetorians in marble Rome, but sent only clipped denarii to the frontier, some bearing the face of an emperor already dead. In one icy corner of Germania, a unit passed around a cup of sour wine and carved the name of a former general, now declared traitor by the Senate, into a wooden post deliberately planted inside camp lines, declaring him their true emperor. The message was not subtle. Their loyalty, they made clear, could be sold, but not bought cheaply. What held the legions was no longer the weight of Roman authority, but the civic theater of direct promise, still most weighted, because mutiny was dangerous, because punishments came with iron and fire, because centurions remembered decimation, flogging, crucifixion for slaves, fustuarium for soldiers, and because the empire needed the outer provinces quiet. But beneath that stillness, resentment thickened like pitch. The camp, once a symbol of order, became a crucible. Inside its rectangular walls, sweat mingled with suspicion. 8-man tents grew colder, voices lower. The clang of chainmail began to feel closer to the ring of coin, a sound tied less to glory, more to survival. And somewhere behind a locked chest, the tribunus recalculated delayed pay under candlelight, hoping that the next barge from Lugdunum would arrive before the winter did. Because if not, the men might calculate value their own way, with sharpened blades and a new mutiny song echoing through pine-dark forests. Not all mutinies erupted. Most smoldered, waiting. As long as the silver was clipped and the land postponed, the fire waited behind every tent flap. The empire, vast and gilded, tugged its border tighter, but the strongest loyalty could still unravel at a coin's edge. In the heart of a Roman castrum, between tight ranks of leather tents and the wood-and-earth fortifications of the Vallum, rose sacred zones that defied the filth and fury of campaign life. They were not temples in marble, nor altars clad in bronze, but makeshift shrines erected with discipline's care and devotion's haste. In the bitter marshes of Pannonia, or the cold drizzle of Britannia's squares of canvas and turf, housed numinous presences, Mars, patron of armed order, Mithras, god of mysteries, and loyalty bound in blood, Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, king of the deconsents, who ruled above emperors and centurions alike. Here incense mingled with the stench of sweat, iron, and animal dung. The gods lived like the men who served them, stretched taut between conquest and decay. No order of the Roman world landed among the soldiers more deeply than that of sacred obligation. Every legion carried not just its eagles and weapons, but its numen, daily rites to the genius legionis, the spirit of the unit, reaffirmed identity. Veterans left dedications incised on altar stones to Jupiter or the genius century, their brotherhood of 80 men. Religion was not abstract, it was shoulder to shoulder with labor in mud and in steel. It was spell and response against the unseen, against disease, ambush, mutiny, and death. Even the site of the shrine mattered, centrally located between the Principia and barracks, where rank met rank and soldiers passed in silence, catching only a flicker of smoke or oil as they marched to formation. But order is not immune to erosion. By the late 2nd century, legions stationed on the long rivers, Rhine, Danube, Euphrates, heard new voices whispered through the reeds. Cults from beyond the Hellespont, paschal mysteries from Syria, sun-born salvation from Persia, and funerary resurrection rites from Egypt began to thread through the tent lines. Mithraea's subterranean sanctuaries carved under forts hosted initiates in candlelit vows where bulls bled and ranks dissolved beneath cosmic reenactments. Each grade of initiation, Corax, Leo, Pater, offered symbolic status beyond the census and stipendia. In the brotherhood of Mithras, slaves communed with commanders, and even centurions bowed before higher truths. The Roman gods demanded loyalty. The Eastern ones offered eternity. This was not defiance but desperation. For a legionary dying far from Rome beneath the frozen pines of Rhaetia, or the parasite-lush swamps of Mosia, official offerings to Mars often failed to shield flesh from spearpoint or bile from plague. Jupiter thundered from above, but he did not soak bedding, ration barley, or explain why promised land grants never came. Soldiers had eyes for those gods who came close, gods who bled, who offered signs in dreams, who whispered salvation in the night wind. At Vindolanda, on the northern edge of Britannia, fragments of personal letters have survived scratched onto wax tablets and thin slats of wood. Among the names, curses, and shopping lists, there are invocations to strange deities, outside the formal pomerium of Roman Orthodoxy. At Mariport near Hadrian's Wall, a cluster of altars bears repeated dedications, not just from officers but from common soldiers. One to Mars, a later Mars, the nourisher. Another to Baladucadrus, a local god grafted into Mars' stern frame. These were pragmatic polytheists drifting gods together as campaigns drifted into seasons. Sacrifice was insurance. Faith was a wager. Yet belief had boundaries, boundaries tested by hunger, boredom, and blood. When the Annona stuttered during border offensives, or when salaries were withheld by a distracted imperator, divine protection seemed increasingly contingent. And when omens soured, an eagle flying west instead of east, or the haruspec's reading rot in the goat's liver, the shrine's silence was deafening. Even the priest of Jupiter could only pretend to shout above a legion's growl. Some commanders, those with eyes on more than the campaign, responded as politicians, not pontiffs. They encouraged the cult of the living emperor, requiring loyalty oaths sworn on the numen Augusti. Others sponsored multi-ethnic festivals to placate a garrison half-raised in Syria or Thrace. The auxilia Rome's non-citizen soldiers brought their own devotions: horse gods from the Danube, forest spirits from Gaul, desert lords from Palmyra. The sacred camp became a mosaic no longer geometric and Roman but sprawling improvised plural. Still amid disorder, sacred order clung to form. Each new shrine was marked, bounded by stones or poles. Sacrifices followed formulas. Even novelty obeyed precedent. The camp might crack, but it would not collapse overnight. Ritual steadied the center, and yet always the night came. On the eve of a surprise Germanic incursion across the main, one legion's mourning rite to Jupiter was interrupted by a missing standard. Not stolen, deserted. A grave sign. Some say a newly converted signifer refused to hoist it in honor of profane gods. Others say the shrine itself had been defiled in the night. The fire scratched out the wine, blackened with soot. In either case, by afternoon, 9 miles of forest had gone silent, and centurions began marking their contubernia for withdrawal. The shrine still stood, cut in turf, ash scattered to the wind, forgotten within the hour. Faith, structured, codified, magnificent, had once underpinned the roads of empire. In the shadow of that belief now crept silence and choice. A soldier could worship with the unit, or in secret beneath a hill to a god who promised sunrise in the grave. Once these altars bound brotherhood. Now they signaled divergence. Beyond the next river, dusk thickened. Somewhere in the tree-lined local gods smiled toothlessly. They needed no columns, no liturgy, no shrines. Just absence and time. For centuries, a Roman soldier's world ended at the edge of his castra. He might march 30 miles under armor through alpine snow or Gallic mud, but before he removed his Gallia, he and his contubernails would raise the camp walls. The stakes went in before the sun dropped below the tree line, not for comfort but survival. In the forests of Germania or the high plains of Dacia, the rhythm of construction beat louder than any war drum. Earth was to be claimed, not rested upon, and the enemy's horizon never stayed quiet for long. No general advanced without ensuring the know-how of the architecti engineers, who surveyed the ground before the legions even saw it. Their stylists traced out the Via Praetoria, the fortified perimeter, the Porta Principalis dextra and sinistra. Within hours, geometry became reality. Timber revetments, earthen ramparts, and curtain walls with watchtowers were hacked from raw landscape, imposing Roman order on land that had never bowed to it. Each camp was a statement of dominance, drafted in chalk and finished in sweat. Yet all symmetry could crumble when snowmelt flooded the trenches, or when thunderheads brought down not just rain but barbarian ambush behind it. Inside the ramparts, logistics governed survival. The Annona Rome's rationing arm moved with relentless intent. Flour, wine, legumina, and dried meat traveled in ox carts and supply mules guided by schedule and standardized weights. Each legionary drew about 30 calories a day less if the line stretched too far, or if harvests had failed in Gaul. When the granaries of Lugdunum ran empty, or Germanic cattle raids severed supply lines, bread shrank and tempers flared. The enemy did not have to wound the men to sap morale. He only had to cut the road behind them. When camp was raised and drill hour done, the soldier belonged to his 8-man tent, the contubernium. He lived there not just in rest, but in laughter, rivalry, and volatile fraternity. Shared cots, shared wine, shared secrets. They gambled, they brawled, and when night crept in, and inspections waned, they sought warmth in the arms of camp followers. Lixie whores, laundresses, traders, and unofficial wives. Rome forbade formal marriage in the ranks for most of its long republic and early empire, but tents did not listen to Senate decrees. They listened to howls in the dark and footsteps on frosted turf. The greatest morale killer was not charging steel, but delayed pay and broken promises of land that turned comrade into cynic. Discipline bound the fabric together. War, after all, was only the last test. Discipline molded obedience in peace. The centurio knew this. His Vitus, the vinewood staff, was no ornament. It bruised flesh and instilled fear. Punishments were not made in whispers. Flogging, decimation, even execution, all dealt without recourse to appeal. Inside the castra, a legionary was subject to military code, stripped of rights granted under civitas. One could die not for failure in combat, but for dozing at his post. Yet terror only worked if morale held, and in the alpine snows of Rhaetia, a winter without leave mail or money bred more rage than Rome knew how to silence. The men muttered oaths not to their gods, but to each other, and the edge of the gladius knew no rank when loyalty dissolved. Among the rows of tents lived others, slaves, laborers, local interpreters. These auxiliaries and hangers-on staffed forges, stables, and kitchens. Many were loyal, few were watched. One night on the banks of the Elbe, a stable boy vanished under a broken fence post. In his tunic he carried hand-drawn layouts of the Eastern Gate, the night guard rotation, and the general's itinerary. 2 nights later the bructory came. Their war cry wore the accent of the boy who once shoveled manure. Wages were meant to insulate against treachery. Each legionary was paid in coin, aurae, then increasingly debased denarii shrunk in weight as emperors stretched silver supply to cover new fronts. Under Augustus, a legionary might earn 225 denarii annually for 25 years service, but by the reign of Tiberius donatives were delayed, deducted, or falsified on ledgers. And when the polished tribuni sat in dry tents counting coins, while soaked veterans patched sandals in ditch water, bitterness brewed hotter than any frontier skirmish. To hold morale, commanders turned not just to pay but to the gods. Canvas shrines dedicated to Mars, Jupiter, and Mithras rose between tents. Painted banners, incense, smoke, and sacred oaths gave divine shape to a life of mud and fatigue. Yet Mithras whispered promises of rebirth inscrutable and Eastern, while soldiers bled for emperors they had never seen. When faith no longer provided symmetry, and the gods of Rome seemed distant from the Aeclus or the Carpathians' private shrines kindled quiet rebellions of belief. Then came silence from Rome. No messenger, no envoy, no Senate decree. Just cold nights and unpaid hands. So the army spoke for itself. In the fields of northern Italia, 49 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar faced the Rubicon with 1 legion at his back. The Senate had ordered him to disband his command. He listened instead to the murmur of tents behind him, men who had bled under his standard since Gaul. He crossed. The oaths to raise publica to imperium bestowed by Senate and people evaporated. In that moment, the voting body of Rome moved from the comitia to the camps. Acclamation, once reserved for battlefield valor, now crowned emperors. The castra had become not just barracks but ballot box. That transformation would echo through emperors and crises to come. But even after Caesar, even after Philippi and Actium, the fight for Rome's soul never left the tent lines. Beneath the sound of clanking harness and mule bray, one question smoldered when the Senate's voice fades: who speaks for Rome? The lawgivers on the Capitoli, or the men who sleep in the mud with swords across their chests? The pension was supposed to be peace. After 20 or more years under the standard, a legionary might receive a plot of land in some distant province, Dacia Pannonia, Africa Proconsularis, or a purse of gold diluted but still stamped with the emperor's face. He left the castra bearing scars, dulled oaths, and a discharge scroll marked with honorable service. But the habit of command dies hard. Stripped of the rhythm of watches, rations, and drill, many veterans found civilian life disordered, unsharpened, like living in a tent with no centurion outside. The coloniae, those settlements seeded with ex-soldiers, dotted the frontier like stakes, driven to hold the empire firm against the dark. In theory, they spread language, law, and Latin farming tools. In practice, they spread unease. A man who once rose at the Bucina's call and marched under the eagle now spent his days watching sky and border, not for omens but for horsemen. Crude wood palisades replaced stone ramparts, town meetings replaced the clear orders of a legatus legionis. Amid fields that resisted the plow and tribal neighbors who did not forget the iron hand of past campaigns, many veterans clung less to peace than to the memory of the camp. In Moesia Inferior along the Danube, the veteran colonies had grown since Trajan's wars. The soil was heavy colder than Italia, but had seen 2 generations of soldiers retire and raise Roman roofs over native mud. Yet even here discipline frayed. Few could recall the last proper drill, few recognized the new legates sent out from Sirmium. Pagan temples stood empty beside shrines to Mithras and Christ, and though the imperial stipend still arrived, sometimes it came in clipped coins or not at all. Then in 251, while the Emperor Decius was campaigning northward, the storm broke. Gothic warbands under the chieftain Cneva crossed the frozen Danube near Novi not as plunderers, but as a column, wagons, families, horses, warriors. They moved with grim cohesion, not like raiders, but like rivals. Roman scouts from nearby Casella were impaled along the road to Nicopolis ad Istrum. Panic spread not just among citizens, but among the veterans who remembered what iron meant, but had not sharpened theirs. Without coherent walls, settler colonies were not fortresses. They were false echoes of order. Old centurions tried to rally citizen militias, invoking their years under Marcus or even under Severus. But age is not authority, and resentment lingered. Local leaders drawn from decurions and priests resisted calls to militarize. One morning in August, smoke rose from a villa near Montana, and the fields below it burned in arcs that followed no Roman surveyor's grid. The Goths had bypassed the army, entirely slipping past the camps, as if the empire had forgotten to draw its line in the soil. Decius turned back too late. He met the invaders near Abritus, hoping to fence them in against a swamp. But the marsh, like the frontier, betrayed geometry. His army weakened by disease and irregular supplies. Decius' son was struck down by javelin. Then Decius himself vanished beneath the mudded waters during the rout, the first emperor to die in battle against a foreign foe. His death did not only break morale, it shattered the pretense that Rome's outer provinces were reinforced by loyalty and readiness. Veterans watched the smoke from their hilltop homes and felt some for the first time that Rome could lose. For those who had once pitched tents in straight lines and carried water in shared shifts, the lack of perimeter was more than tactical, it was existential. The castra had been more than wood and trench. It had enforced time-value succession. In its square was the Principia, where the standards were posted beside the image of the emperor. In the latrine they had cursed the rain. In the bathhouse they had whispered sedition, worshipped Mars, and mourned comrades. Once removed from the system that bound them, the veterans held only memory, and memory cannot rally formations. Some tried to rebuild it. In later decades, ad hoc fortlets and watchtowers sprang up along the weakening limes. Town militias were trained in imitation of Roman ranks. Sons studied the old commands ad signa petites parity, but the rhythm was gone. Discipline without pay is brittle. Loyalty without presence is a coin clipped too thin. And as the 4th century wore on, even the idea of a camp began to change. Rome moved from formation to fortification, from perimeter to projection. Mobile field armies replaced static legions. Coloniae turned inward, their walls thickened not for outward proud visibility, but for siege. The veterans' dream of land legacy and lawful Roman peace gave way to uncertainty. Walled towns ringed with debt subjugated allies, and children more fluent in Gothic loanwords than in Cicero. Yet some still buried their weapons in the fields, oiled and wrapped as if awaiting recall, as if the vexillum might rise again above the tree line, as if the eagle could reappear where the palisade once stood. But the forest had begun to reclaim what terrain could not hold. Under the roots of quiet pines, the lines of the old camp faded, and beyond the next ridge riders wheeled silently in the dark. Even now, long centuries since the last centurion called the roll, the shape endures. A square traced in weed-choked hedges, a right-angled ghost rising in the wheat stubble of a German field, some half-consumed rampart scarring the Scottish hill line. These are not ruins of towns. They are not outposts of commerce. They are camps, castra, and to the Romans they were as essential as the legion itself. Wherever Roman power marched, the earth was claimed by posts, ditches, and geometry before it was claimed by blood. And then the grid was abandoned, slowly then all at once, when the frontiers buckled and the boots no longer returned. From the early republic to the final twilight of imperial control, along the Rhine no organized Roman force moved without its own shadow. A marching camp assembled at each day's halt. Square enclosed, oriented with mathematical precision, it was both fortress and ritual. Legions built their castra habitually, their discipline shaping timber and turf, as surely as it marched in ranks. The grid was not a luxury of peace. It was a necessity of war. In wild country, amid enemy scouts and uncertain whether the time to build was finite, the sun's descent, not Roman deliberation, set the clock. Each camp followed the rubric of Roman military engineering. A ditch and rampart enclosed the grid. 4 gates pierced the walls, with the Porta Praetoria facing the enemy. Inside, 2 principal streets, the Via Praetoria and Via Decumana, cut the space into military order. The general's tent, the Praetorium, occupied the nexus, flanked by standard shrines and command quarters. Around it, in sectors measured to the pace, tents of soldiers, stables, workshops, and storage quartered a mobile army of thousands. At full strength, a Roman legion numbered over 50 men. Its camp could house triple if auxilia and slaves were attached, but no blueprint could guarantee safety. Rain collapsed ditches, frost split posts. In the forests of Germania, or the bogs of Rhaetia, symmetry endured until the first scream broke the line. The grid was more than shelter. It was a statement of civilization, of Roman dominance over space and time. And when that failed, it failed completely. Even in forests, the air smelled of bread. The Annona, Rome's tremendous logistical artery, carried not only supply but morale. Salted pork, dried beans, sour wine, and coarse loaves fed the legion more surely than its eagles. Grain mills accompanied the column mullions, and Clibani kept the ovens hot against northern damp. But Roman roads could be cut, harvests foiled by frost, fords rendered impassable. In those hours, a hungry cohort looked not to the enemy, but to its own officers. One missed convoy could break morale faster than barbarian cavalry. And beneath the tent flaps, Roman order softened. Each contubernium tent held 8 men, a furnace of affection and resentment. Dice hissed across boards just before lights out, oaths were sworn in half-whispers. Behind the walls, local women, unofficial wives, and merchants selling trinkets or pleasures formed a shadow world the officers half tolerated, half patrolled. It was in these lit and smoky spaces that brotherhood formed, and sometimes mutiny brewed. Discipline, the spine of legionary success, was enforced with a clarity born not of law but of pain. Centurions drove order with their vine staffs, their scars both proof and warning. Flogging, demotion, or even decimation could follow desertion or cowardice. Yet even fear had limits. In the winter camps of Upper Germania, whispers of unpaid wages reached fever pitch. A veteran once decorated turned his blade inward, striking down his optio with a practiced sweep. Even the primus pilus no longer slept easily, and not all danger came from beyond the vallum. Camp slaves, interpreters, and scouts spoke tongues foreign to Latin command. Many cooperated willingly, but not all. One recorded incident along the Upper Elbe speaks of a stable boy native to the Bructeri who disappeared one fog-heavy night. In his absence, a route map and watch schedule vanished. By dawn, the tree line pulsed with riders, and the camp walls were tested before the morning horn sounded. When the grid failed, it did so from within. The legions fought not only for Rome's borders but for imperial promises, land, reward, recognition. Gold coins, or at first later denarii, but increasingly clipped, debased, or delayed. Officers dined in dryness even as men paced beside cold hearths. It was in camps, not forums, that the wages of empire were counted or withheld. When Tiberius hesitated to pay demobilizing troops, the mutiny echoed not in the hills of Pannonia, but in the silent fury smoldering from latrine to Praetorium. Between mud and discipline, Rome raised temples. Canvas shrines to Mars' altar, carved stones for Mithras, small altars lit by greasy lamps, all stood between the tents and workshops. They promised order beyond the sword, eternal purpose for men who might die faceless and far from home. But the gods shifted too, as Eastern cults whispered rebirth, and legionaries sought afterlife in place of annuities. Then came collapse. Along the Rhine and Danube, as the 5th century darkened the west, fewer legions returned to their former posts. Villas crumbled, roads vanished beneath moss, but the castra remained, embalmed in dirt, etched in satellite images, betrayed by the ugliness of their precision. At Abusina and Intercissa, steep gates opened into ravines built not for use, but for order's sake. Geometry outlived garrisons. The forest drank the camp but could not digest it. Now the fields hold their breath above these outlines. Beneath furrow and hedge the square waits, etched in turf, haunted by iron nails and rotted sandals. The grid never quite left. It lingers, a ghost of imperial ambition and Roman certainty entombed in the soil. But the forest has returned, and with it fog and shadow. And though no trumpet calls, the watch wind still moves through phantom streets, as if the next cohort is only a day's march late. The land, patient and unconquered, remembers. Before the sword was drawn, before orders echoed down the ranks, the stylus had traced its lines into the dirt. Every legionary column marched not merely with arms, but with grids, silent blueprints for the night's castra. The meditors advanced, surveyors rode ahead under guard, seeking ground firm enough to hold geometry against nature. In fertile plains of Gaul, or along the tamed stretches of the Danube, the land often complied. But in the shadowed woods of Magna Germania, where wind stirred among pine trunks and watchers blinked through underbrush, the earth resisted the Roman square. Their time was bought in javelins, not hours, and failure to stake the earth before sundown meant sundered formations by morning. Speed was survival. A chain of commands from the Praefectus Castrorum dictated placement, the Porta Praetoria facing the enemy or direction of march, a vallum of turf, rising with stakes cut from nearby forest heath, and the central Principia plotted without error. The Via Decumana bisected the compound in strict symmetry. When the sun fell behind the treetops, the hammering of tent pegs and clang of pickaxes became an urgent metronome. Every man bore a share in construction, apart from those placed on watch beyond the ramparts, where the boundary between discipline and death trembled each dusk. In Germania especially, the perfect gridline often collided with wet ground, uneven routes, or worse, unseen movement just beyond torchlight. Inside the camp expressed the hierarchy of command in timber and cloth. The Praetorium, headquarters tent of the commanding officer, sat squared by design and immune to the commotion of other ranks. Rows of tents extended from it in purposeful order with contubernia, 8-man squads sharing leather shelter, assigned by century and cohort. Each section was not merely a lodging space, but an echo of Roman identity itself. From Hispania to Syria, the tent rows looked the same, proof that the Republic's atom had survived even into empire grind, all races and customs, and the legions stamped out order. And yet beneath the veneer of structure, the human belly often dictated higher loyalty than law. The Annona Militaris, Rome's grain and supply system, was an artery stretched far along insecure roads and hostile terrain. Wheat baked into buxolatum beans and casks of vinegar wine followed every march, guarded more fiercely than silver. The average soldier consumed about a modius of grain per week, standard, reproducible, but fragile in execution. When floods washed out Gallic bridges, or when hostile tribes burned orchards ahead of the Roman schedule, supplies dwindled. The men felt it first, not in their stomachs, but in their silence. Hunger rarely broke ranks, but it bent them. Camaraderie and rot fermented side by side in every contubernium. 8 men packed per tent, their gear cached behind, their secrets kept within. Here discipline met laughter, dice rattled in bowls, and grievances nursed like wounds. Erotic liaisons with camp followers, banned but ever present, blurred the frontier between Roman and foreign order and wilderness. When pay arrived late as under Tiberius during his Rhine campaign, and rumors spread of Eastern legions granted better land or booty, the smell of old beer and old leather took on a sullen edge. The camp could protect from the enemy, but not always from its own resentments. Centurions, steel-backed veterans of countless campaigns, held the line. They enforced discipline amid through ritual and rod. Wooden cudgels thwacked against armor, names shouted during formation, reports filed with cold exactitude. The primus pilus top centurion of the legion owned both the hard respect and quiet fear of hundreds. Yet even his authority could fray. One winter bivouac in Rhaetia ended with axes rising in the night, a murdered optio, a missing coffer, and a cohort that greeted morning with shackled wrists. The frozen ground hid both guilt and motive. Not all within the palisade were Roman. Dozens of scout civilians and enslaved labor moved between tents, delivering orders, grooming horses, cooking meals. Camp boys from conquered tribes acted as grooms or signal runners. One of them remembered only by a missing name, and the aftermath vanished from a winter post along the Elbe. By dawn, a cohort's route had been betrayed. Dark shadows moved between trees, and those who had spoken Latin allowed the evening before died to men wearing bructory torques. And yet the camp endured. Wages in ore kept soldiers loyal, but the empire more often paid in debased silver denarii, irregular bonuses, and hard promises of farmland and coloniae. Soldiers weighed loyalty against delay when coinage fell short, and donatives were deferred by generals. Hedging their promotions, tents fell silent again. The tribuni militum, sons of senators with clean boots, remained dry while men died for pittance. It wasn't always the barbarians that frayed the ranks. It was Rome forgetting to feed the price of blood. God stood watch. Portable altars to Mars or Mithras were pitched near the Principia, censer smoke curling across canvas. Some whispered toward the stars, others downward toward graves. As garrisons moved farther east into Dacia or Mesopotamia, foreign cults bled into the barracks. Soldiers once chanting prayers to Jupiter now shared symbols with Eastern sun priests or the shadow-born rites of Mithraism. The sacred grid held for a time, but the divine order too began to split. The soldier's loyalty was Roman only so long as Rome spoke back. Camps became power centers. When emperors were proclaimed by troops at Lugdunum or Carnuntum, the rubber of civic law gave way to muscle under oath. Caesar himself had once turned south with a legion rather than discharge them beyond the Rubicon. The camp ceased being a tool of state. It had become its electorate. Veterans resettled in Coloniae under Domitian or later under Septimius Severus found that without the daily rhythm of the camp, the drills, the rations, the shared voice, the mind wandered. Some drank themselves into oblivion, others sought plunder in Municipia. When Gothic spears burst across the Danube in 251 CE, there were no barracks to withdraw to, only pensioners in scattered farms who remembered the rhythm of the drum, but not how to raise shield wall in time. And yet even centuries later, the shape of the Roman camp endures. In aerial images, in hedgerows, in buried post holes, a vanished army still breathes beneath soil, but the Rhine frontier now whispers in a different tongue. As the last vexillum was lowered and marsh reclaimed the ditches, the forest began to speak again. Its silence is not emptiness but waiting. Spring 15 CE, Germania Magna on the edge of the Weser River. Mud sucked at sandals as legionaries drove stakes into sodden turf. Speed was survival. With Arminius tribes shadowing every move, delay risked ambush or disaster. The scent of pine smoke clung to tunics as hammers echoed across the clearing, timber rising in a measured grid. Inside, the half-built castra men boiled grain for the Annona cursed wet gear and eyed the woods with clenched jaws. Beneath one vexillum, tentmates scraped dice on a shield boss, gambling their meager stipend deal. Augustus, engineers had laid out a plan, ration cuts by 1/5 tents by century palisades first. But dusk in Germania rarely fell without blood. By the time the sun touched the pine tops and the breath of Germania turned cold beneath the eastern wind, The tribunes had already marked the ground. No legion marched a full day without preparing to root itself in order. Before swords were unsheathed, styluses were drawn across dirt, mapping out the praetorium, the via decumana, and the vallum. The drawn earth came first, only then could Rome claim presence. To the Roman soldier, the enemy was not simply the man behind the tree. It was disarray, fatigue, and the dusk itself. Even in the dense woodlands beyond the Rhine, where Bructeri scouts flitted unseen, and the very soil conspired to trip a man's stride, the procedure was relentless. The castrum had to rise before nightfall. First the surveyors, then the ditch diggers. 2 men per tent. 3 hours of labor minimum. 1 for the trench, 1 for the rampart, 1 for the palisade. The rhythm never altered except in defeat. On rare occasions, during hasty retreats or sudden ambushes, as in Armenia under Pedus or Judea under Cestius Gallus, the legions dispensed with the camp altogether. But that was an admission Rome had lost the initiative. The standard camp followed design so exact it might have been copied from Vitruvius himself, a grid imposed daily on foreign soil. The Via Praetoria ran straight from the main gate to the command tent. The Porta Decumana guarded the rear. Each legion claimed the same portion of space down to the tent quadrant held by the Aquilifer guardian of the eagle. The perimeter ditch, usually 6 feet deep, was dug even if the enemy seemed days away. For the Romans' threat was not presence but possibility. Order, however, had its burdens. Supplies for 50 men moved on wheels and feet, not on hope. The Annona Rome's heartbeat of grain and salt pork had to keep pace across mountains and rivers. Wagons groaned with sacks of barley, amphorae of sour wine, smoked sausage strung from wooden crossbars. A single day's halt demanded 20 tons of provisions. While centurions enforced discipline with their vine staffs, it was bread and oil that truly pacified the ranks.